All right, this video is covering what happened in the Middle East in the wake of the end of World War II and Britain and France abandoning, for lack of a better term, the mandates that they had in the Middle East, and the situation that was going on in Egypt and in Israel during the Cold War. And we'll talk a little bit about how that's gone for those countries moving forward into the modern day. So if you'll remember back when you talked about World War One, part of the conversation around World War One is the idea that the world is put into this mandate system. These mandates were supposed to be temporary governing bodies for former sections of the Ottoman Empire that had been taken away, and parts of Germany that had been taken away. And they were given to Britain and France to temporarily administer, to govern for a brief period of time, basically so that the French and the British could help create these stable democracies within these regions, and then they would be granted their independence. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen. World War II happens, and by the end of World War II, Britain and France are like, I don't have time for this. And so they let go of the mandates and they become independent. They create these new countries. You'll see here, I left all the notes that I'd made when we did this in class last. So I apologize about that. I know it gets a little messy. But they created these new countries in the Middle East, which has led to a lot of problems in the Middle East. There's a lot of, particularly in Israel, there's a lot of Jewish versus Muslim issue, but also because there weren't stable governments, there weren't stable systems in place, there wasn't a stable infrastructure in place, it's allowed for a lot of political turmoil in the Middle East, which, if you follow modern news, you know that there are extremist groups that run governments in the Middle East, and there are a lot of human rights violations that happen in the Middle East. And a lot of that can harken back to the fact that there's not a stable, recognized democratic system protecting those rights, or even a stable, recognized monarchy system. There's no stable government that's providing equitable access to their people and that sort of thing. So just like the conversation with Africa, in the Middle East, there's groups that don't have access to basic human rights. There are demographics of populations in particular countries that don't have equal rights under the government. I'm thinking here not just about women in some of the Middle Eastern countries, but also different types of Muslims and Christians and Jews, depending on what country they're in, aren't recognized equally and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of discrimination that happens in those countries for education and for economics and those kinds of things that a political system really should be mindful of, but unfortunately is not happening in a lot of those places. So, for example, just in the last couple of years, women in Saudi Arabia, which we're not going to talk about in this because it wasn't part of the mandate system, but Saudi Arabia is a big power in the Middle East and they're a kingdom. But women in Saudi Arabia were just recently given the right to drive cars, to obtain a driver's license. That's the kind of inequities that we're talking about here. So, moving to Israel. Israel was created by the support of the United States after World War II as a safe haven for the Jewish people. The problem with the creation of Israel is that there were Palestinians living there. There were Muslims living there when we took that land and gave it to the Jewish population. So we literally forced people to move off their land and into their countries. And there's been violence ever since. Israel's literally been at war with someone since the day it began. The Yom Kippur War is the big thing to highlight. It's a major event for the country of Israel. It takes place in the 1970s, and it's a battle between an Arab coalition, largely the Palestinians and the Egyptians, and the Israelis. It's also called the Ramadan War, or the Arab-Israeli War. But it ultimately is a win for Israel. They gain a lot of ground. They make a lot of political strides in this war that happens largely because of the support of the United States. The counterpart to Israel would be Egypt. in the Middle East during the mid 20th century. While a territory of Great Britain under Queen Elizabeth, who's the current Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II, the Egyptians nationalized the Suez Canal. So they were an independent country. They got their independence in, I want to say, the 1930s. But the British retained the rights to the Suez Canal. The British were still operating the Suez Canal. And you may remember that the Suez Canal is built, cuts through Egypt by the British to get to India faster. It connects the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. And that's the point, is that they were using it as a transportation hub. So when Egypt got its independence, Britain was like, that's fine, but we're going to keep our canal. So they continued getting all the revenue on the taxes and the tolls and trade that's going through the Suez Canal. And so in the, I want to say the 1950s, maybe the 1960s, the president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, he brought in like his military, and they took over the canal and brought it back under Egyptian control. That's what it means by nationalized. They're an enemy of Israel, and since Israel is an ally of the United States, Nasser and his government sought an alliance with the Soviet Union. And so in the concepts, we're talking about the Cold War of communism versus democracy, they side with the communist government, though they aren't a communist government themselves, because Nasser is a president. The other thing that happens under Nasser is when we're thinking about building and access and that sort of thing, one of the things that he does under his rule is he pushes for the building of the Aswan High Dam. And that dam is on the Nile River. You can see it here from satellite imagery. It dams up the Nile, and they use it for hydroelectric power, just like Smith Mountain Lake Dam is used by AEP. But it also controls the flooding of the Nile River that, if you may remember from World History 1, floods, and that's how the Egyptians grow their crops, right? Is that it brings in fertile soil and that sort of thing. Well, he now can control when that happens so that there's not it eliminates the when's the water coming kind of concept. You can rely on it for planting and for harvesting. You can, the populations that live near the water aren't impacted by the heavy flooding because they know sort of when it's coming because the government's controlling that. And it also provides a lot of electricity. So it's fixing electrical issues. It's bringing in revenue for the government. It's fixing agricultural issues. So that's one of the ways that he overcame the environmental problems of living, in a desert, and also fixed some of the access issues for his country. So, as always, if you have any questions, let me know.